So are we recording now? Oh yeah, I got the little red dot. All right.
You do? Okay.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for the fourth and final installment of our Population 101 series. Today we're going to be talking about how to talk about population pressure. Next. So my name is Sarah Bailey, my pronouns are she, her, and I am based in Western New York, which is occupied Wenhadrin land. And I'm the Population and Sustainability Organizer within the Population and Sustainability Program here at the Center for Biological Diversity. I do a lot of work managing our Endangered Species Condoms program and our Pillow Talk outreach. And before working at the center, I've always had a love for wildlife. So I've had jobs doing wildlife rehabilitation and environmental education. And next I'd like to introduce my colleague, Kelly.
Hi, my name's Kelly. Pronouns are she and her. I'm a campaigner with the Center for Biological Diversity. My background is in waste and recycling, but I got an MPH, a Master's in Public Health a couple years ago with an interest in working in family planning. So super excited to be with the center, kind of meshing all of my interests. And I am on the Powhatan, Monacan, and Cherokee land. So thank you all for joining us.
And next up, we just have some housekeeping. I know we all probably have a decent amount of practice with Zoom at this point, but just some friendly reminders. Please just put yourself on mute, at least for the presentation portion, to reduce background noise and feedback. If you need to know how to mute yourself, you just want to hover over the square with your video in it, and there will be a little mute button you can click next to your name. You can also go to the bar of your Zoom window and the microphone. Once you click that, there'll be a red line through the microphone to indicate that you are muted. As for your camera, if you want to be on camera, it is nice to actually see the human faces I'm talking to, but I also totally understand not wanting to be on camera, so I will leave that up to you. Similar to the microphone, that icon, it's the camera icon next to the microphone. If a red line is through, your video is off, and if it's not, you're on. And throughout the presentation, you can put questions in the chat box and we will be sure to answer them at the end. The way we've been doing these webinars is we record the presentation to share later. We stop recording before the Q&A and discussion portion though, just so people feel more comfortable sharing. So as you have your questions, throw them in the chat. We will address them at the end. And just as a heads up, the default setting will send your question to everyone in the chat to see. If you feel sensitive about your question, you can select, instead of everyone, select it and send it to just me or Kelly and ask your question anonymously. And then as always, be respectful. These are sensitive topics. So just remember, you know, we're all humans with feelings behind the screens. Next. So as always, I like to go over just some background about why we're talking about human population growth and what those numbers look like. So the recent uptick in population growth has been in the last 50 or so years, where it's kind of very steady, and it's been a big upshoot in the last half century. And what that looks like is adding over 200,000 people per day worldwide. And right now we're at about 7.8 billion people, and we are projected to hit 11 billion by the end of the century. Next. And so why we care about that as an environmental organization is that in the time that the human population has doubled, wild vertebrate animal populations have halved. So as our population grows, we continue to put pressure on the planet and be pushing various species closer to extinction. Next. And then just also show what this looks like in regards to consumption, since that's also a big part of our work. We are currently using up the renewable resources of over 1.5 Earths. Unless we change that pattern, we're going to need 3 by 2050, and that's not a thing we have. So I'll get into this more of how it's more than just numbers of people, but also we address our patterns of consumption. Next. So we know what the solutions are, and they are solutions that advance human rights and equity. So the solutions we advocate for at the center are access to education, healthcare, and voluntary family planning. Sorry, thank you. But just because we know the solutions doesn't mean it's simple. There are real political and cultural barriers. And as we'll discuss in more detail, there are concerns about how population work impacts communities of color. And being sensitive to these concerns and being culturally inclusive with our work is an ongoing learning process for us. And sometimes it gets messy, but we're committed to these values and the process of continuing to improve. So to give you an overview of the center's population work, we are domestically focused. So while we support global reproductive freedom, we specifically address human population growth in the United States because of our outsized impact on the world. And our work is nuanced and multifaceted. We believe the debate between population growth versus consumption or individual versus systematic is a false dichotomy, and that we can be working from all angles on this. Our solutions are centered on human rights. We advocate for global gender equity and empowerment through ethical, non-coercive solutions. Like I said earlier, like solutions like improved access to education, healthcare, and voluntary family planning. And we are not prescriptive with our recommendations. We don't tell people not to have kids or that there is an ideal number for our global population. There's so many factors that go into this. It's very hard to come up with a clear number or an equitable way to get to it. And our work is necessary. We can't ignore human population growth. And by not talking about it, we miss an opportunity to denounce xenophobia, racism, and human rights abuses as perspectives that have no place in this movement. Next. So before talking about how to talk about population, I think it's worth looking at why some people don't want to talk about population. And it's not a one size fits all. There's a lot of different nuances to that as why people don't want to talk about it as well. And these categories come from Diana Kuhl's article, Too Many Bodies, the Return and Disavowal of the Population Question. We'll share a link to that article as well, because I think it does a really good job of explaining this and is a good starting point. So one of those categories is population skepticism, and that's denying the population is an issue or claiming that population density is beneficial, which can be tricky because population density can potentially be preferred over sprawl and continued land use change, but can also lead to more intense impacts when you have more people in a smaller portion of space. There's population declinism, which is the argument that population is not an issue because the growth rates are slowing. And they are, but there's still a lot of room for improvement, especially in terms of ensuring reproductive freedom for everyone. There's population decomposing, which looks at only addressing the components of population pressures rather than population growth as a whole. And I think that kind of gets at like a lot of technology can save us of like certain aspects, but a lot of these solutions don't always scale up when taking into account population. But you know, in a very real sense, I can understand how breaking it into more manageable parts is an appealing perspective, which I think is important to look at like the motivations behind some of these. There is also population fatalism, just that the problem is too big and complicated to even begin to try to solve. And it's intimidating, but we at least want to try, right? That kind of is the all environmental issues as a whole is they're big problems, but we want to do our part. And then there's population shaming, which is just that claiming that population work is inherently racist. And population shaming and population skepticism are kind of especially dismissive and tough to tackle because they make the work just feel morally untouchable or just attempt to negate it altogether. So those are two tough ones to negotiate with. Next slide. And then just to kind of get into some other nuances and reasons people don't want to talk about population. This is from our Nexus survey that was done last year, and the report just recently came out. Kelly, did you want to touch on this? You're muted.
Sure. And it just dawned on me, I will put a link to the full report in the chat also, but we asked, you know, how do you feel about discussing population? And actually the majority didn't have any concerns discussing it, but of the 30 to 35% or so that did, Their biggest issue was that it was just a very complicated topic to discuss confidently. The political climate, of course, was a challenge, and that they thought their peers would maybe not appreciate discussing it. Those were kind of the top three, and then it gets kind of small, these other reasons after that. But yeah, I will make sure to put a link to that report in the survey. Although this is not in the full report, so this is only for the sneak peek people that actually join the webinar.
The VIP benefits.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool, thanks for covering that, Kelly. So it's important to listen to these concerns and really look at why people are taking issue and potentially do not want to discuss population. So it is about more than just numbers, it's about people. And we need to think about that when we're having these conversations as well, to be more inclusive. And we need to recognize that these concerns are valid and based on events that are more recent and closer to home than most of us realize. And I really like this graphic for active listening. It's something that's come up in a lot of our staff workshops. It seems very intuitive of just listening, but there's a big emphasis on not immediately responding. And I'm a very animated person. I like to respond and like nod and like agree. But it's really about just taking in and processing everything the person is saying before you do any response. So the steps are: pay attention, withhold judgment, reflect, clarify, summarize, and share. So what that can be said is really just focusing your energy on processing what the other person is saying rather than what your response will be, which can be tricky. If we're in a situation where we like don't agree with someone, typically we are coming up with our rebuttals mid-conversation. I do this. So it's just something to consider practicing. And we thought about that. That's a little hard these days. We're not having as many face-to-face conversations. So think about other areas this can be practiced in your life, whether it's online conversations and dialogue. And just overall remembering that, like, behind any like written piece or video, like they're, again, real humans are behind this, and that's worth considering in our responses to be sure, we're being respectful and, again, inclusive. And yeah, next slide. So when I say a lot of these injustices are closer to home and more recent than we realize, these are a series of headlines that come up in the population discussion. So top left, probably one of the more familiar examples is China's one-child policy. So 5 years ago, it ended after 35 years. But I think what kind of goes under the radar for a lot of people is that it just became a two-child policy. It's still limiting family size and reproductive freedom. And there were a lot of issues with this. It's a really common example of population control, and there are a lot of issues with infanticide of baby girls because of the cultural value of having boys. And this has had downstream consequences of skewed sex ratios and just like frustrated single men because there are like not a lot of women around. There are literally not enough women to find a partner. So these are consequences down the road that aren't taken into account and things we don't want to repeat. To the right of that is an article about the birth control trials in Puerto Rico. The first large-scale study of the birth control pill we know today was done in housing projects in Puerto Rico. And it was given at much higher doses than that we give it today. There were side effects. When women did die, there were no autopsies done. So these were not ethical trials with consent, informed consent. So just kind of like the darker history of some of the reproductive tools we enjoy today. Bottom left is a little known history of forced sterilization of Native American women. Again, it's easy to think these injustices happened in the past. They're certainly not something we're seeing today, which is not true. This happened in the 60s and 70s. And even this year, there were all those headlines about forced hysterectomies at ICE detention centers, to the point that one gynecologist was described as the uterus collector. And these are happening right in the United States. And then the last one is an article about forced sterilizations in US prisons. And again, just to emphasize, everyone deserves reproductive autonomy. Sterilizations do not fix any of the systemic problems that they claim to be addressing. And we'll be we'll be including links to these full articles in the chat if you would like to read up more. Next slide. So familiar institutions are also reckoning with their past to be more anti-racist moving forward. I'm specifically highlighting these. It's not to call them out. I think they're actually doing a really good example of addressing some of the historical injustices that they've been involved with or associated with. And we'll be sharing articles that actually show their reflection of it and how they are planning to move forward. Next. So my first example is John Muir with the Sierra Club, and he's an iconic conservationist in the environmental movement. His writings have inspired generations of people to see the sacredness of nature, but he also made a lot of derogatory comments about Black people and Indigenous people. And this is particularly ironic given that he was advocating for the preservation of land stolen from Indigenous people. That's sort of a whole issue with the conservation movement as a whole. And there were other early Sierra Club leaders who were involved with eugenics. Next slide. Then there's Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood. She's a contraception and women's rights pioneer, but she was also a big supporter of the birth control trials in Puerto Rico that I described earlier. And she was also involved in the eugenics movement. And she had an interesting perspective within that. She still saw, like, with deciding who is unfit and fit, she had her own perspective of how that should be defined. I included the quote here. I admire the courage of a government that takes a stand on sterilization of the unfit. And second, my admiration is subject to the interpretation of the word unfit. If by unfit is meant the physical or mental defects of a human being, that is an admirable gesture. But if unfit refers to race or religions, then that is another matter which I frankly deplore. So where she drew the line was mental and physical defects could be unfit, but race or religion should not play a part. And Planned Parenthood has, denounced this status or perspective of hers. She endorsed a court decision that did rule that the compulsory sterilization of the unfit was allowable under the Constitution, which allowed people, the state to sterilize people without their consent. And again, Planned Parenthood has denounced her endorsement of this decision. So just one of those, like, looking back at history, not just saying, hey, it was a part of the times, but saying, we do not agree with this, and this is not how we want to move forward with our work. Next. Then there's John James Audubon with the National Audubon Society. Again, super renowned ornithologist, artist, and naturalist. And he was very well known for compiling the birds of America. But he was also a slaveholder. And while he relied on people of color for local observations and collecting specimens to help with his collections, he did not accept them as socially equal. Next. And this last example isn't associated with any one organization, but is just another reflection on how we view these historical figures. So James Marion Sims is called the father of modern gynecology. He studied tools and surgical techniques related to reproductive health, many of which we still use today. But he conducted research on enslaved Black women without anesthesia and often without their consent. This painting depicts him with 3 slaves, so I think it's worth noting their names, Lucy, Anarcha, and Betsy, who are 3 women he operated on, according to the American Historical Association. And currently medical ethicists are kind of looking at, there are statues to him and monuments to him, and many will argue that these should be either taken down or reframed as tributes to the women he experimented on. So that was a lot. If you have not heard a lot of this history before, this is a lot of information to take in and process. So I'm gonna take a breath. Recommend just take a breath too. We're gonna talk about now how we move forward. Next slide. So how I've trained volunteers in the past. Yes, I think I recognize a lot of your names. Some of you have volunteered at Pillow Talk events or have given out the endangered species condoms. And the way we've presented this before, we go over talking points and tone, words we use and don't use. So we've always have said we don't use words like population control or overpopulation. because they have an understandably negative connotation, and that's not what we're advocating for. We also don't take a blame or shame tone. Our presentation's usually pretty fun, especially with the condoms. We're trying to keep it light. We're at fun events. We just want to share information with people. And we're not forcing anything on anyone. We don't make anyone take condoms if they don't want to. We're not telling them they need this magical form of contraception that's going to be the best. Again, we just want people to be more informed. And I think these training points worked well. Overall, after several years of Pillow Talk, sounds like things were well accepted. People enjoyed our presentation, so things were working out really well. But this works great for short conversations, like 5 minutes and less, while you're tabling at outreach events. But as we get deeper into this subject and have more nuanced conversations, we want you feeling confident promoting equitable solutions. Next. And to get started on that, we are currently still working on resources like webinars like this and other materials. But what you can find on our website now is we have a frequently asked questions video. It's yours truly modeling some of the tougher questions we get. And there's a nice handout that also has it like written out if you prefer to read rather than watch a video. And just to reiterate, as far as advocating for ethical and non-coercive solutions, we support improved access to family planning, education, and resources. And that also includes supporting abortion as essential healthcare. And we do not think limiting immigration is the answer to addressing population growth. And for more on that, we have both of those statements in support on immigration and population and our statement on abortion on our website that you can read more thoroughly. I'm not going to read them to you right now. But those will be in the chat if you'd like to look at them more. The next slide. So now we're going to get into how to address common pitfalls that happen with these conversations. And we use this cartoon all the time in presentations. It does a nice job illustrating not wanting to talk about population. So we've got to deal with the root cause of global warming. Right, let's talk sustainability. Let's talk clean energy, sustainable agriculture, and carbon footprints. Actually, how about we talk about sustainable human population growth? Sorry, we don't talk about that. We're going to teach you how to talk about that. Next slide. So first off, which I've said already, and this is already in our messaging, but just to reiterate, population pressure involves consumption and the number of people. And we want to correct the people's thinking that is that the only issue is one or the other, which comes up in these conversations sometimes. We also don't want to be fixating on the right or optimal numbers, like what is the right number of children to have, or perfect fertility rate, or ideal number for the global population. Again, like I said earlier, so many factors go into that. So we don't think it's the right thing to focus on because consumption factors into what numbers the planet can support. It also means not focusing on any certain groups any of us view who are having too many children. Again, everyone should have the right to have the kids they want. So we don't want to focus on any specific groups. And that also looks like, deciding to solely focus on high fertility countries or areas of high need, implying that any people should or should not be having kids. Disregarding, again, the historical injustices we discussed, or supporting policies that dictate the number of children people could have. Next slide. To go off that, we need a combination of approaches and solutions to address the impacts of population pressure. So we don't want to perpetuate these false dichotomies of either or thinking that are going to leave out critical parts of the solution. So a lot of that I kind of mentioned on the previous slide. When there's this either or mentality, it just kind of oversimplifies everything and doesn't bring in all the aspects of complexity that we need to be looking at to really address these things. So population versus consumption is a typical one where, there's no point of focusing on population if we're not addressing our consumption patterns, or vice versa. Focusing only like higher low income countries. And another one is individual action versus systemic action. Some folks will say, like, why does it matter what I do if corporations are still polluting? But individual choices do matter for building up like people power, and like even with something like having kids, talking about it, ending these taboos, it can help shift the conversation. We also don't want to make absolute statements like anything is the single largest problem or only solution. I will keep saying this, there are many different ways to work on this, and none of them are like the best. There's a lot of different ways to tackle things. Next. So we need comprehensive strategies that incorporate a justice and rights-based approach from many angles and denounce any coercive policies or rhetoric. And again, this comes back to like espousing about or dictating the number of people, number of children people should have is not the solution. So again, like any of those policies like China's one-child policy or eliminating the tax credit for children or enacting tax penalties, anything that takes away people's reproductive freedom, like forced sterilizations. But instead, we want to be looking at long-term holistic solutions. And this can be everything. This will incorporate education, healthcare, healthy and safe environments like the planet as a whole, and gender equity for everyone. And also looking at specific barriers communities may have to these solutions. And part of that will be fighting against systemic racism by promoting policies such as fair housing, voting rights, transportation, and wealth equity, because these are often the underlying causes of a lot of other social issues. Next. And again, if we don't talk about population pressures at all, we miss a chance to promote the just and equitable solutions. So by dismissing these conversations altogether, that leaves space for racist and xenophobic ideas that we do not believe has any place in this movement. So even if the conversations are tough, it's important to have it when you're putting out the good solutions. And there's, understandable, all the reasons I cited earlier of like, if people think this conversation is racist or eco-fascist because of what's been done. But if you're putting forth good solutions, that helps change the conversation. And yeah, sorry, next slide. We also need to be supporting agency, bodily autonomy, and reproductive justice for the BIPOC and LGBTQIA plus communities, which face more barriers to reproductive health care. And that means correcting the lack of gender inclusivity and equity that often occurs in these conversations and ensuring equitable access to quality healthcare for everyone. So we need to empower and educate people to make their own choices, but that we need to recognize there are real barriers in the way, and that not everyone has the same access to care, whether that, again, be things like insurance, transportation, funding. There's also like what we've seen is a disproportionate focus on cis women and the expectation for them to have sole responsibility over their reproductive futures when there are cultural and societal gender equity barriers. And often that just means like all the responsibility should not be on women with this. Men are part of the equation of reproduction as well. And we want to see more of that incorporated in. And it comes down to don't tell people what they should or shouldn't do with their bodies. And being sure to discuss these topics with sensitivity, humility, and respect, and be conscious of the words you're using and their potential meaning to others. Next. And I've said it before, but it bears repeating. Everyone should have the right to have or not have children. We do not want to target specific groups for any reason, because that denies them reproductive freedom, which everyone should have. And it's important to, when we see this as such an population growth is an urgent issue with the environment, it sometimes can be easy to disregard that family planning is a very personal and emotional decision, and we need to always treat that with respect. And mandating or recommending contraception or sterilization based on race, income, ability, or education is also something we don't want to do. Nor do we want to stoke any myths or stereotypes about welfare fraud or other false, harmful ideas about why people have children. So again, respecting everyone's family planning decisions is what we want to be doing, and reinforcing the need for equitable healthcare for people to make their own choices. Next. So what now? It's okay to feel a little overwhelmed. This is a lot. This is a process, but it's one we're sticking with because this is a critical issue. And having these conversations more equitably and inclusively will help us shift the conversation and get more people talking about this. So the solutions, while complicated, are still a little bit straightforward. It's about helping fill the unmet need for contraception and improving access to reproductive health care and providing comprehensive and inclusive sex ed. and also addressing systemic barriers that make it difficult for all to access reproductive health care. All these other things in life that impact when we can get to the doctor, like insurance and transportation and funding. And also those are similar barriers to how we can live sustainably as well. Next. So we can all work better to recognize and understand our own unconscious biases. Stay tuned, we're going to be putting more resources online about this to kind of help us think and frame these conversations better. And I will offer myself as a resource now. I'm happy to continue this conversation with you and answer any questions and discuss further. If we don't cover it today, my email is there. And then this illustration is kind of gets at some of the mechanics of unconscious bias. Your brain has a system 1 and system 2 thinking. And your system 1 is fast, unconscious, automatic, it's everyday decisions, and it's error prone. Whereas your system 2 is slow, conscious, effortful, does complex decisions and is reliable. And in the reading I've done about unconscious bias, it's about really thinking about the decisions and how you frame things. And basically the idea is to retrain your system 2 brain, again, with this like hard thinking, thoughtful work. And you can retrain your brain for your system 1 to act in a more ethical, equitable way. So this is stuff that is not fixed. We can retrain our brains. And it's kind of cool to visualize the mechanics of that. So I thought that was useful. So with that, we can stop recording because we're going to move on to the discussion portion.
One second, hold on.